Happy to be here. What I will do here is exactly as Sebastian said. I will give a little bit of a mix of the talk that I gave at TEDx Berlin on Wednesday and that I gave at the conference yesterday, the political conference yesterday. The subject of my talk is the book The Nordic Secret that I wrote together with my Danish co-author, Lene Andersen. Lene is a Danish philosopher and writer. And before I dive into, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my background and my foundation, just to give a little bit of a framing of the book. But before I do that, I would want to create a little bit of a cliffhanger. And that is looking at the cover of the book. So this, of course, represents the Scandinavian modernity, the Swedish car industry and the Danish design industry. Up there we have Schiller and Goethe, and that is sort of the German connection that Sebastian was about to give away. But then this woman up here. So now nobody says anything. If you recognize her, please be quiet. But everyone think, so what is she doing on the cover of The Nordic Secret? And who is she? Who is she and what is she doing on the cover of the book? I'll come back to that. I'm a mathematician and physicist by training, and then I've been a business entrepreneur during my whole life. I started about 20 different companies, many of them very, very small, but a few large. So I started IT group, I started real estate company and a banking group. When I sold my banking group in 2006, I spent 2 years thinking about what to do with the second half of my life, and I decided to set up a foundation in Stockholm. And the foundation is called Ekskäret. And Ekskäret is the name of the island that my foundation owns, and it means the oak tree island. And on this island and in my foundation, we are very interested in this connection between our personal inner growth and societal change, and how these two processes go hand in hand throughout history. And we believe it's very important, this understanding, for the place where we are right now in the development of the Western civilization. During the summers, we have youth camps, a number of youth camps out there, where young people between 14 and 16 and 2 weeks trying to find themselves. And for the rest of the year, we have invitational conferences and retreats for adults, where we do essentially the same thing, and that is to try to find ourselves and grow our inner worlds. Now coming to the book, I think it's important to start by reminding us about how fortunate we are. Many presentations I go to start with all the disasters today, and I will come to the disasters, but I think it's important to remind us about this, that we actually live in the utopia of our grandparents. And I more or less mean that literally, because if you look at those guys there, any one of them could actually be my grandfather. It's not further away. That picture is actually exactly 100 year old. And of course, when my grandparents were teenagers, they couldn't dream about the world we have today with modern medicine, the technology. Even I think it's important to remind us that this is not just comparing their situation then with the rich part of the world. I would say that today 90% of the world population actually lives in something that would be a utopia for my grandparents in Sweden. So with that in mind, still we are living in a very turbulent time. So I put up some examples here. We have the hidden algorithms, we have the environmental destruction, globalization, migration crisis, Brexit, and Trump. And I think that all these crises are actually expressions of one underlying meta-crisis. The meta-crisis of our time. And that is our collective inability to manage the increasingly complex world. Our collective inability to manage the complexity of our world. And I think the word collective there is important because individually we can feel extremely stressed out of the complexity, but still we have tools and methods and we can be better or worse on handling that complexity. But collectively we are super bad at handling these issues. And of course it's important to remember that many issues in our world we can and we should handle individually, but also many issues we need to have collective action to have something serious happen. And two examples there are of course environmental problems. We can't solve them just on an individual basis. We need collective action. And another example I would say is the global market. Setting the rules for that system is something that we cannot do as individuals. That is something that we need to do collectively. And of course this complexity that we are constantly living through, that comes from many sources, but the biggest source is of course the accelerating growth in technology. And this is, as we saw from the first slide, basically good news. We shouldn't forget about that. This is basically good news. We want this. I want this. But there are a few problems with this. and of course we have had this technological development all the way from back here, from the Stone Age, and going forward. We have had technological progress. But up until fairly recently, the large shifts in society could take place between generations. So for example, my grandparents were farmers, and their parents were farmers, and their parents were farmers. But then their children, they moved into the city and became factory workers. So you could have sort of the adjustments between generations. Whereas now, the technological evolution is so fast that you have major societal shifts during our lifetime. And I think we could afford to take 2 minutes, just take 2 minutes and think about and perhaps discuss with the person beside you how many completely different worlds have you been living in? How many completely different worlds have you or your organization had to adapt to that has changed life really fundamentally? And what I would say as one example, life before mobile phones and after. I mean, that's one typical shift. So take 2 minutes, and then you all will have to answer that question. How many fundamentally different? Okay, so how many completely different worlds? Can I have some suggestions?
Say again, please.
How many completely different worlds? 4. Okay, 4. Any other suggestions? Some younger people with different ideas? What would our youngest participant here say? No, just joking. Yeah?
Not just between like technology and more analog experience, but also where you work, the people, what are the topics you're talking about, and that can be so different.
Yeah. So it's not just technology that is changing rapidly. We also have the cultural change and subjective change or whatever. So I think that even if you are just 25, you would probably have lived in at least 3 different worlds. I would have guessed. Yeah, you're saying yes. And if you're a bit older, then you can have 4 fundamentally completely different worlds. It's definitely, for me, it's before or after television even. And it's before and after mobile phone. And then it's internet. And then it's the smartphone. And I think that those technological shifts has, I wouldn't use the word force, but it has compelled us to adapt our personal lives substantially, and also the way we do business. So then we could roughly say that during our lives, perhaps every 10 years, we have had to reinvent the way that we live our individual lives, and certainly how we do business. But now with this accelerating speed of technology, I would say that it's not that impossible that we ourselves and our children very soon will see that change every 5 years, or every second year, or even every single year. So then the question comes, how will we be able to manage this? Because we are not made for such an environment. So we are coming from an environment that has, at least in technological terms, been more or less constant during one's lifetime. Again, major technological shifts took place between generations. And now we are moving into a world of more or less constant change. So that is one thing that is completely new to humanity. Another thing that is new to humanity is that the world that we've been living in so far has been characterized by scarcity, limited resources. And we have been forced to compete for resources, and humanity has been, 99% of humanity has been starving up until 100 or 200 years ago. And now, hopefully, with this technological change, we can for the first time move into a world of abundance. But moving into this world of abundance could also create problems if we do not watch the environmental aspects. So the third fundamental shift for humanity is that we have, through Stone Age and up till today, lived in what some environmentalists calls an empty planet, meaning that we as humans have been a very, very small part of the ecosystem. And in the Stone Age, we could go out and take whatever resources we needed out there. We could bring them to our cave and we could use them, and then we could throw the waste outside of our cave, and that did not impact environment substantially. Now that is not longer the case. Humanity is now the biggest geological force on Earth. We're talking about the Anthropocene, or as some environmentalists put it, we're living in a full planet. From an empty planet to a full planet. And we are already consuming 1.5 planets, and soon we will consume 3 planets. And that is, of course, not sustainable. So these 3 fundamental shifts are happening during our lifetimes. And every time we have had technological shifts so far in history, we have had to update our societal software. But this time, the update is super crucial and will be super big. Just one thing you could think of there is that many of our, not just our brain is hardwired for scarcity, also many of our key institutions, like the market, depends on scarcity. Scarce products, scarce labor resources meets, and we have a market that is clearing. If you have an abundance of products and the marginal cost of many products, not just digital products, are approaching zero, and hopefully we are moving into a world where we do not have to work 40 hours for 40 years of our lives, but we could do other things. But as long as we are fixed in the market thinking, then that would mean unemployment, and that could be bad news. So if this is bad or good news depends on our societal systems, and some of them we will need to redesign. So to summarize, our brain was developed in a world that looked like this, and now essentially with the same hardware, we need to cope in a world that looks like that. But then luckily, we do not only have our hardware, not only our brain, but we also have our mind, and we have society and our institutions. And our brain, we cannot do very much about. Some of my friends in Silicon Valley tell me that this problem they will solve very soon with a chip that we can implant in our brain, and then it will be solved. Okay? I don't believe that if that would be an available solution, that would be a good solution. I'd much rather focus on the development of our mind and of our societal culture, the societal software. So, this development of our societal software, the updating of our software program in society, that's something that we have done a number of times throughout humanity. The last time we did this on a broad scale was during the Enlightenment. And I put up here a model that is developed by an American institute called the Berkana Institute that describes a little bit these sort of updates of societal software, or paradigm shifts, as they call it. And you can see here the different phases also of how a shift is happening, where you have the old paradigm and then the new paradigm being born. And if we look at the transition we had during the Enlightenment, then of course the old paradigm was the medieval religious dogmatic way of looking at the world that had its height during the Middle Ages. And then technological change happened. The printing press. Not only the printing press, but that was one important development. And that made that paradigm reach its end. And of course what we had was very turbulent times. We had the French Revolution, and after the French Revolution we had the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So the whole of Europe, the Western world, was completely upset for 50 to 100 years. Very turbulent times. But out of that turbulence was a new paradigm. And that paradigm was, of course, the paradigm of science and reason, and what we today call modernity. So modernity was born out of that. Now I believe that we are facing an equally large societal transition. This time, the old paradigm is modernity. That in our part of the world had its peak in the 60s, 70s, perhaps 80s. And then, again, technological shift, for example, internet, not only internet, made this paradigm sort of reach its limits, and we had all these problems that we were talking about earlier coming up. And then, now we are at the point that when something new wants to be born, and we do not know what that is. We can see some sort of contours of what that might be, and I will come back to that a little bit. But the important thing is that we are just now in this middle space where we do not know what is happening. And being in that middle space is very, very taxing. It's frustrating because we do not know where we are going, and we know that the old world does not work any longer, but we really like it and we might want to go back to that. So that really now So if that is the framework, that really now brings me to the Nordic Secret. Because the Nordic Secret, what we are doing in that book is that we are looking at this old transition from pre-modernity into modernity and how that happened in the Scandinavian countries in order for us to learn something about the transition that we are in right now. And of course, many of you have seen this diagram before. It's the world value studies. That is, every 5 years, I believe, they are making a study of it, about 200 countries, and they'll be doing this for 30 years. And the Scandinavian countries are occupying a very interesting position up there. And we would ask also then the question, why are we up there? How come that we ended so fast in the point where almost all other countries seems to be moving in different speeds and at their own pace? But when you follow all the countries in the world, there seems to be a tendency to move up into this corner, and we ended up there very early. I should say as a parenthesis for you who know this diagram that that is of course not the end point. That is not the end of history. There is a development beyond that corner, up there. And that is really sort of the next paradigm. This part here is the medieval. That was a box, and then we broke out of the box. And the up there is modernity. And then beyond that, that is the next stage. But the question here we are focusing on is, how did we reach the corner of modernity so relatively quick and peaceful compared to almost any other country, both in Europe and in the rest of the world? Now, though, we also say in the book that we believe that the Nordic countries are slowly losing it. So we are not putting ourselves today at some sort of pedestal. We're just saying that this transition was managed super well, extremely well. And of course, in discussing this transition, we have to remind ourselves and start with the fact that 150 years ago, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, we were dirt poor countries. It's again going back to my grandparents, and this is a little bit, of course, before my grandparents. Back then, we were so poor and we had so miserable living conditions that in Sweden, for example, up to 20% of the working population emigrated to the US during the second half of the 1800s. People were starving, dying of starvation, eating what we call a bark, the cover of the tree. What is that called? Bark, yeah, to survive. And then just a few decades later, already before the Second World War, we had transitioned from this dirt poor, agrarian, religious, non-democratic countries into modern, rich, happy, industrial societies. And of course, there can be many reasons for this. And of course, in the history books, you find a lot of reasons for this transition. But Lene and I, we argue in our book that there is one important reason, contributing reason at least, that has been forgotten. And that we can learn from this forgotten reason today. And the reason for this, and the story that is not really being told today, is that back at the end of the last century, 150 years ago, we had in all the Nordic countries extremely visionary intellectuals and politicians who knew that in times of turbulence, and they were certainly seeing the turbulence coming because we were late into the Industrial Revolution. This has already happened 100 years earlier in other countries. So in times of turbulence, they knew that we all try to grasp for some fixed point outside ourselves. We look for an external authority, as psychologists say. We look for something or someone to hold on to and to protect us and to put our trust in. We look towards authoritarian leaders or towards religion. We did it back then, and we are doing it again today. But back then, these visionary leaders, they did not want to be those authoritarian leaders. They were firmly committed in bringing democracy to the Nordic countries. And they knew that the only way to build truly stable democracies is to build them from bottom up. That's the only way to do it. You can't do it top down. It's not just putting in a new institution and thinking this could happen like the West tried to do in Iraq and other places. Democracy to work needs to be built bottom up. And for that purpose, they organized all over the Nordic countries retreat centers for inner growth. Yes? Yes? They organized retreat centers for inner growth. You heard me right. Yeah. You haven't heard about this? No. It started in Denmark in the middle of the 1800s. Moved on to Norway, then to Sweden, and it grew rapidly during the last decades of that century. So that by year 1900, there were actually 100 retreat centers like this in Denmark, 75 in Norway, and 150 in Sweden. These retreat centers were state-funded, but they were not state-organized or state-run. They were run by many different organizations with different angles to this. At these centers, young adults with a few years of working experience, perhaps in their early 20s, mainly from the working or farming part of the population, could spend up to 6 months free of charge, with the expressed aim to find themselves. Find their inner compass in order to be able to be active and conscious co-creators of the new society, active co-creators of democracy. This is what one of these centers could look like. Imagine 150 like this in Sweden, just in Sweden. Yeah? So the purpose was to find yourself exactly in order to be able to resist the siren's call of fundamental religion or authoritarian leadership. And when this was at its height, almost exactly 100 years back from today, 10% of each generation of young adults participated in a retreat like this. And of course, this had effect on the societal transition. Apart from focusing on finding your inner compass, the retreats gave you an update on the latest technology within crafts and farming. So it was also practical aspects. They also gave you a feeling for your place in history and culture, and also quite extraordinary, it gave you basic tools to organize civic movements and activism. What a school for social entrepreneurs. So, where did these, even for our time, radical ideas come from? Where did these ideas come from? Well, they came from here. They came from Germany. Well, they came from Schiller and Goethe here. Herder, von Humboldt, all those idealist philosophers that wrote in the beginning of the 1800s. These philosophers were read by all intellectuals in Sweden or in all Nordic countries back then, because back then German was our first academic language. And being Germanic culture, we were all focused towards Germanic continent. So everyone read Goethe and Schiller and Herder and Humboldt. And the interesting thing is that these philosophers, the main thing they did was that they reacted against this Enlightenment's view of our mind as a rational machine. They said, that's not the case. Our mind is not a machine that is somehow miraculously ready, finished, fully developed when we turn 18 and we can go and vote. That's not the case. They said that the mind, our consciousness, is an complex organic system under lifelong development. Under lifelong development. And this idea of the lifelong development of our mind, that really took hold in Scandinavia. I'm not just seeing here if I should skip a few slides. Yeah, I do that. I go here and I say that, of course, these philosophers, they wrote in the years after the French Revolution. And they had put so much hope into the French Revolution and the new society that could be born out of that, a democratic society, not a kingdom any longer, not an authoritarian society, but a republic. But this experiment with the republic ended, as you know, in a bloodbath and in the Napoleonic Wars. And they said that the only way to avoid future bloodbaths in this political liberation, that was for a substantial part of the population to not be dependent for their own self-worth on the opinion of their friends and their peers, but really to be grounded enough in themselves to have their own inner compass and to be able to self-navigate this political chaos. And that is what was lacking in the French Revolution. And they said that you need to have enough many people to be inner guided. And today's modern developmental psychologists, they could say that you need to become self-authoring. You need to become authors of your own life, and you need to do that from within. So then one could ask, okay, but then Germany, then, what happened? These wonderful ideas here in Germany, why were they not implemented here? And the simple answer is this. And that's the difference towards Scandinavia. Because here in Germany, you had the revolutions in 1848. Many cities, revolution. Here in Berlin, the government lost control of Berlin during 3 days. 3 days the rebels, the revolutionaries had control over Berlin. And it took a military 3 days to gain control again over Berlin. And after this experience of revolt, no one in leading position here in Germany had the courage to put these radical ideas into practice. And that had, of course, disastrous effects for democracy here in Germany, because once that was implemented with the Weimar Republic, people were not used to democracy, and you know the rest of that story. So it was instead, as we've seen, in Scandinavia, that these originally German radical ideas became implemented on a large scale. Not many, though, not even in Scandinavia, knows about this story, and that is why Lene and I, we call it the Nordic Secret. So these centers, they are actually called folk high schools, and they still exist today in Scandinavia, and they still receive massive state funding. But after the Second World War, the idea of this purpose of inner growth and becoming inner directed or self-authoring, that was completely forgotten. we reverted back to the old Enlightenment model of our mind as a fixed rational machine. And democracy was anyhow now mostly taken for granted. So to start to conclude, I believe that what we can learn from this is that in turbulent times like this, we cannot expect a new world order to be imposed from above. Whatever wants to be born needs to come bottom up. But it won't come automatically. And this was the genius of these intellectuals and politicians in Scandinavia, because they provided this framework and the financing for this to happen. But they didn't direct how it should happen. So as I said, the centers, they were totally state-funded, but they were run by very many different organizations. So there were workers' union running some of them, there were the non-drinkers organizations, there was even some church organizations, and they all had different approaches. The only thing that was required was that they should not be indoctrination. It should really be providing this space for inner growth. Then you were funded. So I think that today, that the major shift that we need to do is to have a mind shift and look upon the way we see ourselves and realize that this very old model of our mind as a rational machine that we now again are using, we need to leave it again, and we need to look upon our mind as a growing system that needs to be taken care of throughout our lives. And education, but not just education, our complete both organizations and society must take this into realization and start supporting this inner growth in different ways. So, before concluding, I promise to come back to this woman. So, who is she? Rosa Parks. Yes. Yes. How many knew? Yeah, a few. Good. A few. So, who was she?
So in the U.S.,
yeah.
She participated in the civil rights movement, but I think before that she spent time here in Europe, in Germany, and maybe somewhere else.
Oh, you are close, but not 100%. But you are very, very close. So what did she do in the civil rights movement? Anybody else that knows what? Yeah.
She refused to sit in the back arranged.
Yeah, she refused to give up her seat in the bus to a white person, even though the law of the country said that she had to do that. And she has in many interviews said that what gave her the strength to sort of sit down for her rights, to know that even if the law of the land said that she should give up her seat, she knew she had an inner compass saying that no, I got my right, I should sit here even if the law is not on my side. So she stated in many interviews that what gave her that strength was the fact that she had actually spent 6 months at a folk high school, but not in Europe, in the US. Because this concept of the folk high school in a very, very small scale, these retreat centers actually traveled in the footsteps of the immigrants to the US. So there were 4 folk high schools established in the US, and one of them, the Houghton Folk High School in Tennessee, she spent 6 months and gained her inner compass. So this originally German idea that blossomed in the Nordic countries actually played an important role in the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King actually taught at the Houghton Folk High School. So this idea traveled far, has had an impact in the Nordic countries, had an impact in the US, and I think that there are things that we can learn from this today. We shouldn't think that the simple solution is just to set up a lot of retreat centers again. We have other tools today, we have technology. I still think that inner growth mainly take place in the authentic meeting between people. I think retreats are necessary, but perhaps we could have technological support that can help us every day in our inner growth. And then once a week we meet a support group in the city to support us in this growth. And then perhaps, say, every 5 years we have the luxury to go away for a retreat, perhaps not 6 months, but a longer retreat where we can really have an immersive experience and take a big step forward in our maturation and inner growth. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.